Maria had always believed in the dignity of hard work. For 25 years, she had woken up before dawn, tied her apron, and walked the familiar path to the office where she worked as an administrative assistant. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. She took pride in being dependable, in keeping her small life orderly and secure. That morning, however, everything changed. The envelope lay heavy in her hands as she sat at her tiny kitchen table. The words inside blurred through the film of her tears. Due to restructuring, your position has been terminated effective immediately. We thank you for your service. Her chest felt like it had caved in. All those years, her loyalty, her sacrifice, reduced to a cold paragraph. She thought of the rent due next week, the medical bills still unpaid, the meager savings that would barely last a month. Her body trembled as the reality sank in. She was alone, but she wasn't truly alone, was she? She had Adrian. Her son, her only child. A flicker of hope softened the ache in her chest. Adrian had always been ambitious. From the moment he graduated, he had risen quickly, climbing ladders that Maria never even knew existed. He lived in a penthouse now, dressed in suits that cost more than Maria's monthly salary, and drove cars that turned heads. He had everything she had dreamed for him. Surely he wouldn't turn her away. That evening, Maria took the bus across the city. She pressed her worn handbag tightly against her lap, her hands clammy with nerves. When she finally arrived at the towering glass building where Adrian lived, she craned her neck upward, marveling at the sparkling lights that pierced the night sky. The lobby smelled of polished marble and wealth. A doorman gave her a polite but puzzled glance before letting her through. She felt out of place in her plain coat and scuffed shoes, but she kept reminding herself, I am his mother. That has to mean something. The elevator ride seemed endless, the numbers climbing higher and higher until the doors finally opened to the penthouse. Maria stepped out, and her breath caught. The space before her gleamed with opulence floor, to ceiling windows displaying the glittering city, golden chandeliers casting warm light over sleek furniture. It looked more like a palace than a home, and there stood Adrian, her son, her pride. He looked every inch the man she had raised him to be, tall, confident, handsome in his tailored suit. A glass of wine rested in his hand, his wrist glittering with an expensive watch. "Mom," he said, brows raised in mild surprise. Maria swallowed the lump in her throat and forced a smile. Adrian, her voice cracked. I lost my job today. They let me go after 25 years. I don't know what I'm going to do. I just need a little help until I find something else. For a moment, Adrian just stared at her. Then he let out a long sigh, setting his glass down on the marble counter. Mom, he said flatly, I can't do that. Maria blinked, stunned. Can't, Adrian, I'm not asking for much. Just some help with the rent, the groceries, just until I get back on my feet. He rubbed his temples as though she were a burden. You don't understand. I've worked hard for this life. I can't just hand out money whenever someone's struggling. You'll figure it out. You always do. The words cut through her like a knife. Adrian, her voice trembled, her eyes filling with tears. I'm not someone. I'm your mother. But he had already turned back to his phone, the glow of the screen more important than the woman who had raised him. Maria's chest felt hollow as she turned and walked out, the click of her heels echoing against the polished floors. She rode the elevator down in silence, her reflection in the mirrored walls showing a woman who suddenly looked older than her years. Outside, the city lights sparkled cruelly as the night air bit at her cheeks. She clutched her handbag tighter, her heart breaking with each step. In that moment, Maria realized something painful. Her son's world had no place for her anymore. The night felt colder than ever as Maria walked the long streets back to her modest apartment. Her feet dragged, but it was her heart that carried the real weight. Every step echoed with Adrian's words, "You'll figure it out." You always do." She wanted to scream, to collapse right there on the pavement, to ask the heavens why her son, the boy she had given everything to, had looked at her with such indifference. When she reached her small home, she closed the door and leaned against it, sliding slowly down until she sat on the floor. Her handbag slipped from her fingers, spilling its meager contents: an old wallet, some coins, a faded photograph of Adrian as a boy grinning with 2 missing front teeth. The tears came then, heavy and unstoppable. She wept until her chest ached, her sobs muffled in the silence of her apartment. It wasn't poverty that cut her so deeply. It was rejection. Her own son, the child she had carried, nursed, and sacrificed for, had looked at her as though she were nothing more than an inconvenience. Her mind spun with memories, cruel in their clarity. She remembered the winter she had gone without a proper coat so Adrian could have new boots, the cafeteria job she had taken after her first shift at the factory, working late into the night, her hands blistered and raw, just to pay for his school trips. The nights she pretended she wasn't hungry, pushing the last portion of food across the table to him, while she smiled and said she had already eaten. And now this, her sobs quieted to whispers as she sat on the floor, clutching that old photograph. "I gave you everything, Adrian," she murmured, "everything I had and more. Was it not enough?" The night passed in fragments, her body aching, her eyes burning. By dawn, the silence of the room pressed down on her. She rose slowly, her legs stiff, and walked to the mirror above the sink. The woman who looked back at her was weary. Her hair, streaked with gray, was messy from sleep. Her eyes were red and swollen, her skin pale from the tears. For a long moment she simply stared, the weight of her life pressing down on her shoulders. Then something shifted. She leaned closer to her reflection, her breath fogging the glass. She had begged. She had been humiliated. She had been abandoned, but still, she was here. Her voice was soft but steady. "I will not beg again, not from him, not from anyone." She washed her face, the cold water stinging her skin, and tied her hair back. Her hands trembled, but she set them firmly on the counter. If Adrian had chosen wealth over blood, then so be it. She would survive without him. Maria stepped out into the daylight with her handbag once more. Her heart was still broken, but inside it flickered a spark of something she hadn't felt in years' resolve. Her son had shattered her heart, yes, but she would not let him shatter her spirit. The days after Adrian's rejection were the hardest of Maria's life. She woke each morning with a heaviness in her chest, the silence of her apartment reminding her of what she had lost, not just her job, but the bond she once thought unbreakable. Yet hunger waits for no grief, rent waits for no tears. Life, cruel as it could be, pushed her forward. At first, Maria took on whatever work she could find. She scrubbed floors in strangers' houses, her knees raw against cold tiles. She babysat for neighbors, cradling children, who reminded her achingly of Adrian when he was small. She sewed buttons, mended clothes, and carried groceries for the elderly down the street. The pay was little, and the work exhausting, but it kept her afloat. Still, the nights were the hardest. She would collapse into bed with her body aching and her hands blistered, wondering how much longer she could endure. It was Mrs. Patel, her kindly neighbor, who first planted the seed of something greater. One evening, after Maria had brought over a pot of soup, Mrs. Patel took a spoonful and sighed with delight. "Maria," she said warmly, "this tastes like home. Why don't you sell your meals? People would line up for food like this." Maria blinked, startled. She had never thought of herself as anything more than an ordinary cook. For years, she had prepared meals with love, stretching scraps into feasts so Adrian would never go hungry. But could that skill, born of sacrifice, truly be her salvation? The next week, she decided to try. She cooked a large pot of stew and baked loaves of bread, then set up a small table outside her apartment with handwritten signs. Her hands shook as she placed the bowls down, afraid no one would come. But they did. One neighbor stopped, then another. The aroma drew people from the street. Soon, the table was surrounded by smiling faces, spoons clinking against bowls as they praised her food. By the end of the day, she had sold every portion. The next day, she cooked more and more again. Within weeks, Maria's cooking had become known in the neighborhood. People came not only for the food, but for her warmth, her kindness, her ability to make even the loneliest soul feel welcome. Slowly, she began to save. Each coin felt heavier with promise. Each smile from a satisfied customer stitched a little piece of her broken heart back together. Months passed. The small table outside her apartment became a rented stall, and the stall soon blossomed into a cozy shop on the corner. She painted the sign herself, Heart and Hearth. The shop became more than a business. It became a gathering place. Families came to eat together, workers stopped by for warm meals, and travelers left with stories of a woman whose food tasted of love. Maria poured her soul into every dish, and in return she gained something greater than money, dignity. Meanwhile, across the city, Adrian's world was unraveling. His investments soured. His so-called friends who had crowded his penthouse during his wealth slowly drifted away when his money ran dry. The penthouse that once glowed